Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diana Lawson. I am the Dean of the Seidman College of Business, and we appreciate your patience. We had some uninvited intruders on the first Zoom we had, so we had to get off and start again. Welcome to the Friday the 13th. I guess Friday the 13th does bring unexpected activities, but welcome to our webinar series today. Near the beginning of COVID, we did bring in Sonja Johnson and the Van Andel Global Trade Center to talk about global activities and how COVID was going to affect a lot of our companies that do business globally. So we thought it would be a great idea to bring her back with a group of panelists to talk about persistence and perseverance in a pandemic that seems to want to not go away and just continued. So our title is Global Business, Persistence and Perseverance During a Pandemic. And I think we have a great set of panelists. I think this will be a really interesting conversation. So I would like to introduce Sonja Johnson, the Executive Director of the Van Andel Global Trade Center that is housed here in the Seidman College of Business. She will introduce the panelists and she will moderate this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Sonja?
Thanks, Dean Lawson, and thanks for our panelists. I think we've got a great depth of experience with us today on this panel. I couldn't have expected more, and in hindsight, I look at it in a non-pandemic situation, we may not have them all in the same time zone at the same time. So with that, I'd like to introduce our three panelists. Joining us from Meijer is Dormica Oppenhuizen, and she is the Director of International Global Supply Chain and Customs Compliance. And then also joining us is John Lime, from HexArmor. He's the Global Vice President of Sales. So it's going to be really great to see the different size companies. And I couldn't just pick one automotive firm to represent all the complexities going on within automotive. So joining us to represent the automotive industry and supply base, none other than a Grand Valley Seidman College of Business graduate, Mike Wall. He is the Executive Director of Automotive Analysis for I.H.S. Markit and a longtime partner of the Trade Center. And we'll start out with Mike and kind of pick on him a little bit. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself and then kind of what you're seeing from the automotive perspective, since it's so near and dear to Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so my background has been born and raised in West Michigan. We're working with I.H.S. Markit and a predecessor firm about 17 years, but covering the automotive industry for about 20 plus years. And yeah, it has been a wild ride in this industry right now, to say the least, but I'm struck by the resiliency. I think we may have used that resiliency word a lot as of late, and it's really what we're seeing right now with the supply chain in West Michigan, which is a critical function, a critical cog in the machine that is automotive. And the supply chain in West Michigan is not letting us down. So it's been a lift, and there's more to come. And I think Dean Lawson, you know, it was apropos where it doesn't want to relinquish yet. So we're not out of the woods by any stretch, but we're getting by and in a really you know, in a strong way. So I'm hopeful for the future, as they would say, particularly as it relates to autos, and things are still lining up reasonably well, which we'll talk on.
So just to jump back to Dormica, if you could share a little bit about your responsibilities there at Meijer and kind of your perspective real briefly at a really high level.
Yeah, so I am, what my job really entails is getting the product from origin, no matter where in the world it is, in the US or overseas, to our DFs and all of the regulations that come with that. I've been in supply chain now for 3 years, been at Meijer for 9 years, and been in retail for over 15 years in many different capacity retail. And it's definitely been one of the most challenging seasons in retail and years that I have ever seen in my career and retail. It's been very interesting also because in my career, I have worked for specialty companies. So for example, I've worked for American Eagle Outfitters and Sears and those kind of companies that mostly deal with apparel and home kind of goods, and then coming to a grocery store now and then seeing the difference in, you know, how customers really rely on the retailers and the service providers that they really are loyal to, has really made such a big difference in the retail landscape. And it's particularly during COVID, when you can see which stores had to shut down and what stores didn't, because of the stores that are more holistically able to provide so much service to a community and to their customers. So like Meijer, because we're providing pharmacy and gas and food, and you really understand how important those retailers are to community. So it's been challenging, but I think that stores like Meijer has really stepped up to the challenge to provide as much as we possibly can in safety to our community.
Great, thanks, Dormica, appreciate that. And John, certainly not least, can you share a little about your background and how long you've been supporting global sales for HexArmor?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. So I've been with HexArmor since 2009. Initially, the first 5 or so years here, it was focused solely on markets outside of North America. In the last 5 years or so, focused on both the international markets as well as the North American markets. So we work with companies all over the world to keep their people safe. And so PPE has become a household word. This isn't exactly what we were going for when we work with companies to raise safety awareness. But you know, the interesting thing about COVID is it really has brought PPE into the forefront of the public's mind. And so in some respects, we're working with companies just the same as before, just trying to keep their people safe, albeit they have very different challenges now than they had previously. But interesting from a global perspective, always to see how this is playing out in other parts of the world versus how it's playing out here in the US.
Yeah, it hasn't been an easy go in the last few years, and then you add the pandemic onto an already challenged situation in a global marketplace. So I want to put back over to Mike Wall. And Mike, if you can share a little bit of kind of what you're seeing for industry forecast dealing with the pandemic. Turn it over to you real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe we have some slides we'll be referencing or pulling up. But you know, essentially what what we're seeing is we saw the economic side of the equation. In fact, why don't I do this? I'm going to share my screen. All right, perfect. So GDP growth, you know, how we forecast the industry, you know, we use a lot of different macroeconomic factors that set the top line, and then we build up model by model, plant by plant in case of production, model by model, country by country in the case of sales. As you can imagine, GDP is a big driver, and what we saw with what we're referencing here is our look at GDP growth, or in this case contraction, for 2020, the sheer impact of COVID-19, what it's had on our economic environment. And what we've done here is try to take it back, look back to the global financial crisis of 2008 through 2010, and a couple striking things really come apparent right away. One, the immediacy of what we went through there in March, April, and the severity of the downturns easily exceeds what we saw through the Great Recession. Again, the immediacy and the depth of that downturn. And again, it affects almost all walks of life, certainly, and from an automotive perspective, I can attest it had an immediate impact on us, not the least of which was obviously the lockdowns forced plants to shut down, dealerships to close, or dealerships to move to online. So it had a reverberating effect. And the other difference now versus the 08-09 downturn is this did not discriminate amongst countries. You can go down the list. Everyone was impacted to some degree, to severe degrees. Even with China, we're looking at a growth of about 1.9% this year. For anybody who's studied China, GDP growth for China at 1.9% is darn near recessionary, if not recessionary. So it's a challenge across the board. The other interesting differentiation now versus 08-09 is we should be snapping back in a much more rapid clip. Again, we're in and out. Now I say that, and I fully realize we're not through the we're not through the pandemic by any stretch, but we are starting to see some recovery in GDP, some recovery in economic activity, PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, a wide variety of metrics. Again, we have to keep an eye on the case count, and even internationally, what we're seeing in Europe, what we're seeing in other markets as well. But it's something that it's going to be with us, but at the same time, we're navigating it, I would argue, again, rather effectively, all things considered. Scrolling through a little fast. So U.S. light vehicle sales, I got just 2 more slides. Just to bring it back to automotive, what are we seeing? Interesting thing here, and I think Dormica may be able to comment too from a Meijer perspective. What are folks investing in right now? Housing and autos, and of course those retailers that are at the front lines for us as well. We're falling back to that, and we're kind of returning home, for lack of a better term. So again, I don't mean to make light of this at all, but light vehicle sales, insofar as it relates to retail, have actually performed beyond our expectations. Just to give everyone an idea, a glimpse, in March, April, we were looking at U.S. light vehicle sales for this year, these would be new vehicle sales, of about 12.5 million units. In a good year, last year as an example, we were right around 17 million units. So a significant downturn is what our initial expectations were. Again, looking at the severity of the decline and the macroeconomic factors involved. Well, indeed, we have well outstripped, I think, those early, really significant cuts in the forecast. And you can see here, we're currently sitting at 14.3 million units. It was a modest upgrade over even our September forecast update. We tend to update about monthly. And it's owing to the fact that retail vehicle sales are actually, again, performing quite well right now. Fleet sales, again, not to get into too much of the nuts and bolts of it, for folks that are tracking like daily rental, it's been a challenge. Obviously, with no air travel, you're not seeing a lot of rental car activity. But when it comes to retail, it's actually been outperforming our expectations. So we still are having to dig ourselves out of a hole, but it's maybe not as deep as what we initially feared. And when we think about it from an automotive perspective, we also have to think about production, especially when we think about the suppliers in the region. When you look at West Michigan, we have a significant number of suppliers here. We've got suppliers really all around the U.S. for that matter. So we look at North American light vehicle production. Again, last year at 16.3 million units from a North American perspective. The cut was deep still this year, 13 million units. Again, a good portion of that was the lockdowns. Again, not attributing blame per se, it's the reality on the ground. We had plants down 8 to 9 weeks. And with that, it ate up a lot of inventory. And now we're trying to build that inventory back up. And we're building that inventory back up when, again, retail sales are actually hanging in reasonably well. So it's going to take a little longer for those plants to build those inventory stocks. And that's going to carry forward into next year. That's why you see 2021, we're going to get back to 15.9 million units in North American production. That is not too darn bad in the overall scheme of things. I will say that, given that, again, the depths of the downturn. And again, I think part of that is owing to the resiliency within the auto industry and perhaps even to the broader consumer, as it were, in addition to as it relates to obviously what we're talking about here with autos and how auto sales are kind of hanging in there reasonably well. Again, we have a bit of a hole to dig ourselves out of, about a 1.6 million unit gap of that inventory to kind of start. That was basically the gap from sales to production, because we did have production down for that period of time. So we burned off a lot of inventory. We'll be making up for that later this year and really into next year. So we are looking for some growth returning next year. There's a little bit of a gap to our January forecast. You can see that carrying forward. There's a little bit of a macroeconomic lag. There's a little bit of broader lag impacting the auto industry as a whole. But on the overall scheme of things, not too bad, especially when you go and bring it back to 08, 09. It took a good 4 to 5 years for us to return to call it pre-recessionary levels. Here, we don't think it's going to take nearly that as long. In fact, we're probably looking at about a 2-year period, if that. Again, it's owing to, again, that resiliency within the broader industry. With that, that's what I have on my end. Happy to turn it back over to you, Sonja.
Great. Well, thanks, Mike. I think that's a great overview for the automotive industry. And there's so many complexities going on across industries, and we've got very unique industries here on the panel today. You know, John and Dormica, let's start with John. If you can talk about like kind of where your footprint of global sales have historically been for the organization at HexArmor, and just share with where your activity has been for the last several years.
Yeah, so the oil and gas market historically was very strong for us. And in the crash of 2015, it really forced us to diversify. So that really helped us with this recent situation because, again, oil and gas really took a hit. So it's interesting to see some of the parallels between the US and globally. Markets like food, pulp and paper are not nearly as affected as you'd find with oil and gas. And then some of the markets overseas that have probably been a little more effective in dealing with COVID. Australia, New Zealand, they've been pretty much staying pretty steady. Singapore, Japan, China, for that matter, have been pretty steady throughout this year, even though obviously they've had lockdowns as well. In Latin America, Brazil and Mexico seem to have been, we know Brazil has been very liberal in how they've dealt with things. So that has actually meant, from a sales standpoint, a lot of activity as well. And Mexico just seems to have been more active. But Europe, where the last few years, Europe has been very active. This has really caused a real shutdown or a slowdown in Europe from Russia to the UK and everything in between. And then, you know, Middle East has had some challenges, but it's, you know, because oil is such a big factor there, that's continued to move along, even if it's far harder to get decisions and so forth, because things are on a very skeleton crew type situation. But you know, there's no clear end in sight. You know, we're just speculating at this point. So Europe, as we know, has had some additional or reinstituted some lockdowns. So not really holding my breath for a strong European comeback in the next few months, but encouraging to see Asia really starting to move forward.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And Dormica, you're our resident supply chain expert here. Supply chains are not going as smoothly as any of us would like, even before the pandemic hit, just coming right off the Asian holiday season. How has your team been able to adjust and just manage a complex and ever-changing daily situation?
Yeah, so it has been challenging because of the global shutdowns that happened during the spring, and whether just trade was not affected. So the ports were still open around the world. However, the manufacturers were closed, and sometimes there were even street closures. And so people actually trying to get to work, they couldn't. The plants were closed. They couldn't drive on the road. Sometimes there were road closures in some countries, for example, like India and Bangladesh, where they couldn't even travel on the road to get to work. So it really had an effect, and our inventory levels really dropped during that time. And as the reopenings have happened, what that has done is there's been a resurge of demand that has really then caused a peak that we normally would have during this time anyway, because we're getting ready for that fourth quarter and Christmas. It's been double, sometimes in some cases, depending on the category, triple of the volume that we would expect, because the demand is so high, because there is really pent up demand from the consumer, because also, you know, from a savings perspective, and things not being open and shut down, the consumer really has been saving more, so they have money to spend, right? And stimulus from the government has helped as well, and so that demand has really caused us to, whether that is source extra capacity in the marketplace from our carriers. We've had to make sure that we are, from an ocean perspective and from a intermodal, even in truckload, every single amount of even mode of transportation, we've had to make sure we are covering that capacity, which is far more than we would have normally had, for example, on a lane. We've had to figure out also how to, unfortunately, sometimes you have to, the rates also increased, right? So we had to prioritize, okay, financially versus getting the product on the shelf, right? And at the end of the day, we can't sell product without product. So we have to make some of those trade-offs as well. And then there has to be a prioritization that has to occur in terms of, okay, what are our high important categories that we need to manage and work with our carriers to transit first, and then we can kind of keep going down the prioritization. And the goal is to basically, with the team, not let the balls drop, right? So you have all the balls in the air and then try not to let the balls drop.
Yeah, and that's a lot of fatigue too, just for your staff to shift even without, throughout the day. What started with your game plan going into that morning, I'm sure completely changed by mid-afternoon on a daily basis.
It's been a change of priorities constantly. So the team has had to stay flexible. There's been times when we had to say, clear your calendar, we're working on toys. We need to get toys here. We need to get soft lines apparel here. We need to call some carriers. So it's been much of a stay flexible, stay nimble as we work through this. Also have a strong sense of work-life balance as much as possible. So take those moments when you need to, that you're feeling like, okay, I'm going to get burnt out, because no one can go 24 hours a day. You have to step away. We encourage the teams to step away from their desk, get out when it was nice out as much as possible, go walk around, go do something. We've been having a lot of virtual lunches and virtual happy hours and things like that with the team, and a lot of recognition for the team to make sure that we recognize that what they're doing is valuable and we appreciate all of their hard work.
Yeah, and that kind of dovetails on my next question for you is, talent before the pandemic was, industry didn't have an industry that was particularly difficult for. It was across the border. Is each of your perspective on what you guys are doing right now for talent needs now and into the future? How has that changed because of the pandemic? John, can I throw this back over your way?
Sure. So nimble, great word. And that's something we're a small company. And so we've always had to be nimble. So, when this pandemic really hit, we had to really decide, how do we respond to this? How do we work with our customers to keep them safe? Protecting people is what we do. So we shifted quite a bit of production, to making face shields and disposable goggles. On the talent side of things, historically speaking, competency that we really value is flexibility in our team. And so because of that competency, we were able to supply chain, product development, sales, really shift gears, and the immediacy of what we were dealing with around face shields and goggles and people needing that protection, we were able to ramp up production quickly. On the talent side of it, kind of a funny, I think it's sort of interesting. So we get a lot of talent, as you know, Sonja, from Grand Valley, but also Aquinas and Calvin those are great pipelines for us. And so we had just had 3 new graduates, 2 from Aquinas and 1 from Grand Valley. And right as this was going on, and hey guys, guess what? You get to be supervisors in our production facility of face shields and goggles. And I think because we're looking for that flexibility in the people we hire, all 3 really stepped up. One was actually an intern from Grand Valley who did a great job on the supervising side of things. And then the other 2 guys were supervisors as well. So that was the start of their time at HexArmor, was supervising, learning quickly how to make face shields, how to make goggles, and then supervising production of these items, because we had a mass influx of people that were working on this project. So a great example of the flexibility. We'll always look for that in our team. So from a talent standpoint, the competencies that we value, the experience, the attributes that we value, really hasn't changed that much. Fortunately for us, that's always something we valued, that nimble part, that flexibility. And so right now we're in good shape with our team, in part because of that flexibility.
That's great, because you almost had the same problem that Meijer does, with too much going on with what you currently have. And it's good that you have that adaptability with your teams, and still giving opportunity to college students to, get their foot in the door and really challenge them on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
As we go on, if you do have questions, I think we've got our arms around the chat box. If you have some questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat box. We are monitoring those, and we'll get back to you as we can. So if I can pivot over to Mike, obviously you're our automotive industry. They've had their set of challenges, which you've touched on. What are you hearing within your connections within the automotive industry as far as filling that talent need across the board?
Yeah, and it's a challenge. It's still a challenge. Frankly, pre-pandemic, we had a tight labor market, and we were getting that same feedback from suppliers. Boy, it's tough to get people. It's tough to retain them. You flash forward, and we had this disruption, and we're still having that challenge. And I'm struck by the commonality with what Dormica was observing. Satisfying that pent-up demand, trying to navigate, challenging supply chains. Well, that then translates into the labor side of the equation. So what are some of our suppliers doing? They're getting creative, first of all, signing bonuses, having to look at hourly rate, anything to kind of help bring people in off the street, getting creative with their white collar headcount too. They're folks that are on the line, work, trying to get the parts out. And then also leveraging the universities. And most of the suppliers that I work with are working with Grand Valley or working with other local universities, or the east side of the state, same thing over there, to try to either fill in that engineering talent or management talent, or even on the skilled labor side of the equation as well, because it's sort of across the board right now, and it's all hands on deck. I mean, that's the only way I can sum it up, because we're trying to kind of rebuild from the ground up. We're trying to rebuild stocks for sure from the ground up. So we're getting creative kind of across the board right now.
Great. Well, thanks, Mike. And I want to step back real quick. Please, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A. Because of security, we've shut down the chat box. So if you do have some questions, put them in the Q&A section, and we'll be able to see them that way. So again, Dormica, do you have anything to add in the talent area that Meijer's working on?
Yeah, so I think it really is interesting, because with Meijer, because we have so many different functional areas, it really is very different versus the warehouse distribution part of our supply chain is where we definitely struggle the most, because those are more of the blue collar jobs. And I think that whether it's a warehouse at Meijer or a production plant, there has been, just across the U.S., a little bit more of a hesitancy to work. And you're talking about anything with a line in a warehouse, close quarters. So we have had some challenges. So we are doing sign-on bonuses. We are doing, we are using recruiting agency, temp labor to help us with the talent for our distribution and warehouses. We are in the corporate areas. We are still moving with our internship program for the summers, for next summer. So we're actively recruiting for interns now. We've really wanted to expand to make sure, from a diversity perspective, that we're being very inclusive. So we are trying to make sure that if it is, whether that's abilities, that's race, that's gender, and I think that helps us expand. If you think about distribution and supply chain, you don't think about how many women, it's actually far less than we would like it to be. So making sure that you're intentionally going out to other demographics to secure that labor versus what you typically would do, even for like a driver, because we have our own fleets. Do we look at the age? That's something that we've been looking at as well for our drivers. Instead of 21 for their CDL licenses, do we look at 18 for CDL licenses? So trying to expand our demographics, so who we reach out for talent from.
Great. Well, it sounds like there's opportunities out there. People just need to go out and keep seeking, what's available. One thing I look back at our earlier webinar at the beginning of the summer, kind of when things were just starting to open up here in Michigan, was the discussion on the corporate culture. And can each of you speak a little bit for what you're seeing or hearing from the clients you're working with or serving as far as the corporate culture and being able to maintain that culture in a remote situation due to the pandemic? John, you want to start?
Sure. It's an interesting topic because, for us being a small company, our remote people are salespeople. And so, you have, we had actually a Grand Valley graduate who had been with us for a couple of years. We promoted her to regional sales manager, moved her to Louisville, Kentucky, where she knew nobody. And then the pandemic hit. So she's living in an apartment complex with, she had one friend that she knew when she moved there, or a cousin. And so, how do we help her feel connected? How do we help her feel like she's still a part of this organization? And as much as we may be sick of Teams calls and Zoom calls, that really has been a fabulous lifeblood to stay connected to each other. And so put pressure on people like me to make sure that we are reaching out to our team, that we are including them. And actually, it's been a real positive because it's really made us far more thoughtful about how we communicate with people outside of the organization. And so that's been positive. And those same people that are remote also making sure that they're staying connected to their customers, of course, because they can't see them in a lot of cases face to face. So that's actually been kind of a silver lining that I think it's helped us improve how we communicate, how we collaborate. But still, there's, looking at a virtual sales week coming up in December, obviously there's something that's really lost in the translation there, but that's what we're dealing with, and we're making the best of it. And we do have, people here in the office, and so that does help on the kind of Grand Rapids based side of things.
Great. Dormica, do you have anything to add? I mean, your team is really busy. They've been busy probably since 2018 when the additional tariffs started. And then you throw in USMCA to the mix, and then a really disjointed supply chain. How is your team doing remotely?
They're actually doing really well. So all of Meijer corporate has been working virtually since probably middle of March. And it has gone better than I think anyone has expected. I think the teams were a little uneasy about it at first. So how will we do this, right? And not after probably a month or so, everyone just kind of slipped right into a routine and really have found that they enjoy working from home and that we haven't lost a beat in our output. What we've been able to achieve and be able to execute on a daily basis has not slowed down at all. And I think the biggest thing is making sure that the teams really do have that work-life balance, but we've been able to, and for most of the corporate office, there's a lot of Zoom meetings, there's a lot of Microsoft Teams, Skype meetings that are taking place, but it's actually been pretty beneficial for the entire team.
That's great. To some extent, I think in the hindsight, it's surprising how adaptable people are when you give them the challenge, but I do notice some fatigue going on. So a little more connectivity in shorter, more personal ways instead of just diving into the business need, I think helps a little bit. Mm-hmm. Mike, are you seeing anything specific industry-wide for automotive?
Yeah, very similar. It's communication. It really is. And it's hard to over communicate, I think, in this environment. So it's touch points with people on the ground, whether it be in the facilities, of course, and making sure you have that. The really effective suppliers I've been talking to, boy, they have got almost a one-on-one relationship with the staff in the plant. So you've got those frontline folks that they come into work. They don't have the ability to work remotely. So there's that, taking care of them, and then the remote workers. We saw the same trepidation, early on in terms of kind of everybody going remote. But I tell you, the company, speaking from experience on my end, our company, but then also the suppliers I'm working with, that really leaned into, again, those touch points, one-on-ones, you know, with your boss, with your skip manager, and then those other soft side ones, you know, it's the happy hours and those prearranged things, just to kind of blow off a little steam, talk about the week and how it, and I've also seen maybe even a little bit more of a focus on goals and you know, and really trying to set up, you know, career pathing and mapping and that sort of thing in this environment. It's kind of anachronistic to think about that given kind of everything in the immediacy of it all, but it is, I think, forcing folks to really kind of assess. And we're seeing that kind of, again, internally here, but then also with suppliers as well, really focusing on the individual and, you know, how they're doing, and then how they're doing even professionally, and where do they see themselves going, and then of course executing that against the broader corporate initiatives. So if there's a positive that we can take away from that, I think it is. I think we're seeing you know, a self-assessment on the part of the employees on the one hand, but then also a lot of the companies have really shined brightly in this in terms of kind of focusing on their staff.
And to kind of piggyback off that a little bit, as far as productivity, are you guys seeing any efficiencies or some creativity coming from your staff because of the pandemic and the way that they have to think and work differently? Has anybody seen the uptick on that area?
I can, a couple things on that. You know, you mentioned early on that it's surprising to get the three of us on a call with the travel that maybe we do historically. From a personal standpoint, the wear and tear on my body is far less in 2020 because I haven't gone anywhere internationally. And so, you know, it's really forced us to use Teams or Zoom in lieu of traveling. So if you look at maybe a trip I take to Germany that was 3 days, you know, with a day of travel on either side, we're doing that, you know, virtually. You know, next week I have calls with France, with Benelux. You know, I've had Zoom calls with Middle East very regularly, Mongolia, Indonesia, Australia. So it's made us probably more efficient, even though you lose that face-to-face and the meal sharing and so forth. That's been kind of a positive in some respects. And then, you know, since we're not able to meet, kind of thinking about our sales team, since we're not able to see as many customers right now, some of our salespeople can't see customers. It really forced us to leverage some of our existing distribution relationships a lot more effectively. You know, whereas in the past, if we had a salesperson traveling day after day after day all week long, they were kind of focused on that particular week. Now that one-to-many is really helping, you know, being in front of more people more regularly. And so that's been a real efficiency gain from my standpoint. And we really built out a network of pretty amazing sellers because of the necessity of having to do that in lieu of face-to-face meetings.
So while that pause has been nice, I'm just looking at some questions that have come in. One specifically, John, towards you about traveling. Do you foresee international traveling returning at some degree once we get our arms around the pandemic?
I would think so. You know, I think it's going to be probably more discretionary, meaning where, just as an example, in the past, maybe it was tempting to get on a plane for a 2-week trip to Asia to meet with customers. At this point, at least in the near future, it would have to be very, very compelling business case ROI in order for me to want to do that. Not even so much as safety as just efficiency. But I think it'll be reduced travel in the foreseeable future for sure. Again, because of these efficiency gains with Teams and Zoom.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a good point. Dormica, do you have anything from your team standpoint on that?
Yeah, I think that we definitely have seen a much more focus sometimes now on some of why we're doing things, right? Processes, and because you don't have the additional being in the office, and so whether that's dealing with I think the things that come up last minute, and somebody's just grabbing you in the office and saying, or coming over to your desk and saying, hey, what about this? What about this? And there's an ability to focus and maybe question a little bit. So we've seen some processes that we've been changing, which is crazy, right? With everything that we're dealing with. But the team is saying, hey, why am I doing this, right? Why, this doesn't seem effective, or digging into some things maybe a little bit more than they had previously, because they're able to focus on some of the tasks at hand without having some of that outside noise that sometimes you get when you're in the office environment. And so I think that that's been really helpful for the team to be able to have that focus.
Great. So as you guys are looking at the silver linings, is there anything that surprised you as you work through the pandemic? Because obviously, we were shelter in place and we couldn't go to work unless you're an essential worker, which would be Meijer and probably John, your team at HexArmor. But how have things, evolved over time, and any surprises along the way that you weren't expecting, just dealing with your normal organization needs and the pandemic?
From my standpoint, it pleasant, I can't even say surprise, but just so amazing to see what the team has done. Again, that flexibility, but just everybody within the organization, this drastic change for all of us in lifestyle, family, all of these things, and yet people coming to work every day and not just going through the motions, but driving to get better. And I think the title of this was how do companies persevere, and I wrote it down, but perseverance and persistence. And so every day, people pushing to get better and improve processes and go after new markets and to work with our customers in a different way, to adapt to not traveling. I mean, all these things that they've been able to do to keep the business viable, keep it moving forward. And then, thinking about when we get through this, a company like Meijer, HexArmor, we're in great position for the future because we didn't just sit on our hands. We really pushed. And we'll learn from this, of course, and then apply it in the future, just like we have in the past. So I'm actually very optimistic about the future because what I've seen through this whole thing gives me great confidence in where we're going to be in the future.
That's great. Anything to add, Mike or Dormica?
Yeah, I could say from a supplier perspective, I think that resiliency really does, it resonates here, and suppliers, they've experienced levels of this, maybe not to the height and the magnitude, to be sure. There are strikes, there's plant fires, there's disruptions in the supply chain, there's big, recessions like we saw in 08, 09, where you have to get creative and you have to, really focus and get the job done. This was that on steroids, maybe to some extent, as we kind of went through, again, the lockdowns and then emerging from that. But the creativity and the flexibility are huge. The efficiencies gained, which John, certainly touched on. I think we're going to see hopefully a postmortem on this, and an assessment after this when it eventually ends, and then leverage those best practices. I think we're all going to be stronger for it at the end of the day. I could speak even corporately as well within our firm. I mean, we have been thinking differently, acting maybe a little differently. And more efficiently in some ways, and having to be more flexible. And again, I'm a guy who's traveling to Detroit, once or twice a week for 17 years, and I haven't been to Detroit since March. So, but it's been one-on-one with Zoom and Teams and WebEx and every other platform out there to maintain those linkages and whether it be linkages with colleagues, customers, clients all across the board. I think again, from a supplier perspective, that mentality has resonated through this whole process, and we're gonna have to keep doing it for a bit longer, and then hopefully benefit going forward by leveraging those lessons learned.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I've seen, just to add, that I've seen internally within Meijer that I know will continue, and that's been a great benefit, is sometimes because we have so many different areas within Meijer, that sometimes we do become a little siloed, and we've had to be far more collaborative than ever. And so there are, parts of the organization where we're getting on the phone and have daily calls that we would never have had without this situation occurring. And I think it's built relationships, and it's really opened up communication in a way that I hope we continue to leverage, and making sure going forward that we keep that interconnectedness across the company that we didn't have before, and not go back to what we did. And I don't think that people will, because we all have really liked how collaborative it's been, and really talking through things, hopping on a 15-minute call, even though you would have thought, why wouldn't we have done that before, right? But these have forced us to really, I think, leverage all of the technology, that we have, that we could have been using in ways, things that we could have been doing before that we didn't think about. And so that really, that open communication is something that's been really great to see.
Right, and I know we're just coming off the month of October and cybersecurity. I've heard some issues going on around that. As you guys are selling globally, are you seeing impact of increased, cooperation with your IT departments to help make sure that the corporation's keeping on business and has cybersecurity now and into the future as you adapt to these new tools in a pandemic? Can you comment at all how you're working with your IT team?
I have no insight. That's not my world, thankfully, but I trust my colleagues are on top of whatever they need to be on top of, but I have no insight into that.
IT is same for us in terms of, we are actually pretty collaborative with our IT team, even before this pandemic, but even now during, and obviously afterwards, we definitely will be, because of the process that we have, where the business is far more engaged in the process and development of the implementation of a feature, or maintaining a feature, or those kinds of things. I think the thing that has been really interesting, though, has been how quickly our IT team has had to say, okay, we need to build up because of the server demand, right? And those kinds of things that they've had to, where, you have a group of, hundreds and thousands of people that are, now on a video web chats that you did not have before, right? So the overtax of the system and what they've had to do has really, and as quickly as they've had to do it, with a lot of the office going, virtually, has been pretty extraordinary. And they've done it with, minimum disruption to the business.
That's great. Mike, any insight to lend from what you're hearing?
Yeah, very similar to what Dormica was saying. He's making sure the systems, the integrity of the systems. And I did get the vibe, I don't work as directly with clients on cybersecurity, obviously, but when I do talk to them and it starts venturing into that realm, there was heightened sensitivities around that, even pre-pandemic, but and I think some of this is owing to the stories that we hear in general too, about, more phishing experiences and ransomware and all that sort of thing. I think the sensitivities are heightened going through this. So not only are we assessing from a supplier perspective, assessing our infrastructure to be able to withstand this workload that's distributed now to remote colleagues and colleagues still at the facilities, but then also guarding ourselves that, against some of those cybersecurity risks. Those sensitivities, I think, are heightened, but at the same time, going into this, I think they were already pretty elevated, because a lot of the clients I've been working with and those suppliers were already kind of making that part of their business process already.
And with the promise of this breaking vaccination for COVID-19 coming around the corner, and looking at the supply chain, I hate to pick on Dormica. I feel like I'm picking on her this session, but that eating up capacity in the supply chain, are you guys talking about reefer space? Because obviously we do depend on a refrigerated supply chain, both domestically and globally. How is your team looking at that as possible impact of your core business?
Yeah, so a couple of different ways that it will impact us. So one, from the logistics end and making sure that we're working with carriers in advance of what their capacity is. Do we need to add additional carriers? Are there different lanes because of where these locations will come from, of where the vaccine that we'd have to transport, knowing that capacity is already tight right now. It would get tighter during this time as well. So that is one thing that we're looking at. Secondly, from a pharmacy perspective and the administration of the vaccine, whether that's being able to administer it for free in our stores, with how is that all working as well. So from kind of two fronts, we're working that and really looking into what are our options, and how do we make sure that we get the vaccine to anyone who wants it.
Great, thanks. Well, that kind of runs through the questions I have. I think we have just a moment. If anybody that's on with us has one quick question, and then we'll turn things back over to Dean Lawson. Anybody a last minute question on the Q&A? Well, I like to personally thank all of our panelists. I think you did very well given not having a crystal ball. I think, Mike, you're used to getting those kinds of questions all the time, and I'll turn it back over to Dean Lawson.
Thanks, Sonja, and thank you for moderating. Dormica, Mike, and John, thank you for taking the time and sharing your expertise and experience with us. International is very dear to my heart. It's what I taught when I was a faculty member, and I've done a lot of traveling, and I have to say that one of the biggest things I really miss are airplanes. I, like John, have not traveled anywhere since February, and it's very unusual, and it takes a little bit of adjustment to staying in one place. Although it's good not traveling as much as some of us have traveled in the past. As I think about that and think about our international relationships being more virtual instead of physical, I wonder how it's going to change the tightness of these relationships, because for everyone on the call, very well that many of our personal relationships are first and foremost in the business relationships that we have with our international partners. So it'll be really interesting to watch what happens over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years as we move out of this pandemic and take our learnings from it. So thank you again. This was a great webinar. And for the participants, for the listeners, thank you for being with us. This is our last webinar for this year. We will resume webinars in February of 2021. So enjoy the holidays. We have many holidays coming up over the next couple of months. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope to see you all again in 2021 for the webinars. Bye.
Thank you.